Okay, so I'm starting to share my screen. Again, just throw a message in the chat.
Yeah, that's a lot better, I think.
Sounds good. Yeah. I'll probably make this a little smaller. We love technology. Again, we can drop the link. Here's the Zoom thing. Yeah, I can't see the chat right now, so give me.
Yeah, I can read the chat for you.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to drop the Notion link that I sent earlier, that'd be awesome.
Do that right now.
So it looks like I can zoom out. Again, let me know if yeah, you just moderate the chat and stuff, and then we'll kind of keep it at that. All right, so yeah, kind of just starting from the beginning again. Welcome to the ZotHacks workshop. We'll kind of be going over the elements it takes to make that stock UI, which kind of teaches you the basics of navigation and different pieces for that. So I'm kind of just going to keep this like a pretty informal process because I think that'll probably be the easiest just to kind of follow along. Kind of just go through what I'd think if I wanted to make a different UI. And it looks like I'm in the wrong GitHub link right here.
Hey, Lasse, I got a comment if you could zoom in maybe at all. I don't know. I think. Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, I'll keep this one pretty big. Okay, so there, now I'm on the right directory for this. All right, so yeah, and Tristan, if you feel I need to slow down or something, just let me know and kind of use the chat to communicate with everybody. So yeah, so we're kind of going to go into the basics of what I showed a little bit earlier, where we go and create a new page and create some information for that. And then we'll have like the Notion blocks, which kind of make it a little easier for you to go and mark and pull the code from different pieces. So getting into it first, one thing that I showed was when I clicked the different cards, it actually took me to a different directory. So we're kind of going to go over the different pieces it takes to make that. And going over what that kind of involves is, remember in the prerequisites workshop, we talked about how the different routes kind of utilize these different paths. And if you saw when I clicked earlier, it changed the path to like selected stock ID for that piece of information. So that way we can kind of retain like the ID and, route to different components. So let's go in and we'll start by just first making a new component. We're going to keep it in the views directory. We'll call it user stock. And this directory will have two things, just like all the other directories that we have. We'll have a .js file and then also a user stock.css file. This is just the general .sass. To make it a little bit easier, I've already set up some templates just to kind of clean up the code and the Notion. So if you go to that link right there, that'll help you get this piece of code. I just have the blocks that I'm copying and pasting as we move over. So on this one, we'll paste like a few pieces of information. First, we have like the general React imports, which has like use state and use effect. We talked about that and how it kind of like lets you build these component pieces of information. And then we also have some helpful imports like the Axios, use params, some pieces of information to help us pull from APIs and then also get information from the URL. So let's go into the CSS file and take a look at what we have here. We'll go through and paste this piece of information. This is pretty simple, actually. All this is just, we're going to fill the view of the entire height and width of the page that we have. And then we have some Flexbox pieces. And, if you guys throughout the hackathon, I'd really recommend going in Flexbox Froggy would be a great resource for learning how Flexbox works. When you guys are building your UIs, this will be single-handedly the most important thing to know. It'll let you learn how to just place items, and once you learn the basics with this, you can build really complicated like card UIs, entire page UIs just using this responsive Flexbox piece. So, I'd recommend going through that game. Tristan can throw it in the chat. And then there's also something called CSS Grid Garden, which kind of has like grids, which is another way of doing CSS styling. Okay, so let's go into how do we actually, show this page on our, live view. We want to kind of end with a goal where if we click on a card, then it will go and reroute us to the different page that we have. So let's go and copy this route right here, and we'll create it. I'm gonna pull up the Notion just so we can keep it a little same across those things. So I'll replace it with this piece of information right here. What's this doing? This is essentially saying that when we have this specific path, we're going to go and render the user stock component. And we have our components right here, but we need to get it imported into our app.js file. So in the index.js, this is something that's unnecessary. You could import directly from the directories, but having this index.js file on this React template that we're giving you is a really good way to organize the code across the entire project. So we're going to just go and export default as user stock from user stock, this piece right here. We're gonna export it from the file. This goes and grabs the CSS file and also the JavaScript file, and then it means we can import directly from views. Kind of, it's a similar thing with Python, where if you have like a dunder init Python file, then you can import directly from the directory. So we have these two pieces of information, and then all we have to do is go and import right here. So now we have, a specific kind of view. We haven't really hooked it up into the cards, so we don't really know how to get there. But one thing that we'll notice is if we go up to this thing right here and we type in just like a simple ID, we'll end with being on the user stock page. And this is because now React Router is pretty much saying, all right, like, when we have the exact path of like the default one, we're going to render the user list. When we have the exact stock, we're going to just render that. This kind of gets us into a really big part of building your first applications, which is how do you keep different pieces of information on it? And you can kind of decide how you want to navigate by just having like up in the app.js, the parent directory of your entire project will have all of the paths, and then you have like different links going through. So, how do we want to get to this page right here? One thing that we can do is we think about like maybe making the card clickable. Don't worry too much about all these different pieces of animations and stuff. Let's just think about we have our favorite stock ID, and we want to make this card, on click, link to the stock ID. We already have the imports up here, so that can make it a little easier. Link is something that, pretty much means it's just like an A tag wrapper that React Router provides. So we can go through and create our link. We'll go and change and shift the user card that we have to be just sitting in the link. And then one thing that we can do is we can go into just put our stock, and then also, we're not just routing to the stock directory, we're routing to the stock ID that is at this specific click user card. So we're going to do user.favorite stock ID. And this kind of develops our first link structure, which means when we click the card, we're going to just link directly to append the /stock to the user favorite stock. So this should, have like a little hover effect, because now this card is actually an A tag. And then when we click here, we'll go and have this piece of information, already in the URL. So, if we go and click this one right here, or let's go with test3, we have .81, we'll go and see that it's taking this user stock ID and passing it in the URL. And this is, a really big part about how you kind of, you'll learn in your classes about abstracting different classes and having like primary keys for it to identify them. What this allows you to do is kind of have this like asynchronous behavior where you click on a card, it takes you to a separate URL. So now I can just go and refresh this page a billion times and it'll continue staying there. And you don't have like all of this compounding logic in one set of components, and you have it just sitting, on the URL, and then you can render it to anything. And then like Also, if you just wanted to change the URL to a different stock ID, you'd be able to do that as well. So if you give me 1 second, I do have to pull up the other directory just so that way I can have it to make sure that I'm following along on the exact right path. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw in the chat while we're kind of waiting, you know, kind of to give everybody a little bit of extra time. Check out, and I'm just doing this off screen for right now. Go. All right, so let's get into, you know, kind of one element of what this page needs to do. You know, we want this to render information about the stock ID at the piece of like the ID that we passed. So, you know, maybe one way to start with that is let's just get the actual stock ID onto this component, because, you know, we're kind of putting that information in the URL in the card component, but we want to take and keep that information in the actual user stock. So what we can do is, oh yeah.
Could you maybe slow down just a little bit? I think people are having a little bit hard time following.
Yeah.
Maybe could you, is there something specifically that you guys wanted to maybe go over again or explain a little bit slower? If not, maybe we can just kind of try to go a little slower if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll totally slow down. Yeah, so, you know, kind of going back to this user card.
Oh, okay, here's a question. Someone's asking, where did we define user stock?
Okay, yeah, so if we go and look at our directory component structure, we have a few main directories. We have ones called components, containers, hooks, and views. Because views we're going to be keeping as the entire page, we're just going to put it in the views directory. So if you look at the templates that we defined in the Notion file, you can go and copy the userstock.js template and then also the userstock.css template, which will kind of give you the base code so you don't have to type it all out yourself. And then, you know, you'll kind of bring this component in through going to the index file, and this lets us export it from the app.views. So like when we import these things, we can import the user list and the user stock directly from the app.views directory. So it kind of keeps this nice little component structure right here. So we can see like the user list and the user stock. See the export line. Yeah, so
okay.
Yeah, that's one thing that I forgot to leave in the Notion. We're going to throw it right there just to make it a little easier. What this is doing is it's doing export default as user stock. This default as pretty much just lets us rename the file coming from user stock. So, you know, we could name this anything. We could do like test component. And then in our app.js directory, we would put test component. But just so that way we can keep it a little consistent, we'll call it like the user stock rather than the user list. Yeah, so, you know, maybe once we allow a little time for that, you know, unfortunately, we don't have access to the polls right here. So that makes it a little bit harder for this. So I'm just going to have to go based off like seeing the chat and everything. And if you guys still feel it's too fast, just don't hesitate to throw like a little slow down into the chat. We'll bring it and repeat some of the stuff that we're talking about. So one thing, you know, like I said earlier, like we kind of want to get to this point where we render on this link and we show the information on the actual page. So something that I have in the Notion in the state variables section is we'll see these variables right here, which are you know, just kind of pieces of information that we're going to be carrying in the actual user stock component. So we'll go to the user stock component and we'll just go and paste it up here underneath the function. And they have comments kind of describing what they're doing, but we'll see that it uses the use state function, which we kind of talked about in the prerequisites about creating this construct of information that the React component represents. And then we also have the use params function. The use params function is actually how we're getting the ID from the URL. So, kind of how is that information getting here? Like, it seems like this selected stock ID is kind of magic and, filling in from nowhere. This is coming from this label right here. In like the React router documentation, which we have on the GitHub README, you'll find that, Tristan can throw it in the chat as well. You'll find that what you do is you label the variables as colons. So, kind of just to test that, we could also call this test ID. And then we would just go and change that to be test ID right here. And it's based off that labeling, but we'll call it the selected stock ID because kind of the idea of how we got to this page is we selected this stock. So now we have that piece of information in the component. We're pulling it from the URL, and if it's there, then it'll route to this component and it'll put that information in the variable. So to test that a little bit is we can go and do selected stock ID right here, and we'll see it like on the side really quickly, just go and print. And to zoom in a little bit, we'll see that this is the exact same stock ID that we have up here. And now this is like a really useful piece of information because we have, knowledge of any piece of information that we want to take from the URL. We can just go and put it right here. Similarly, test ID or something. And you can build any logic around your application just based on that information. Just because like that'll kind of control how you're navigating around the app. So, what other elements kind of get into this page? One thing that we could think about is we want to get the stock information at this stock ID. Like, remember in the prerequisites backend work, we kind of talked about how we're storing these stocks as their own respective objects. And, we'll get into more like the backend code for how that is in the backend workshop. But we have some stock information that is set onto the API endpoints. And we're not going to worry too much about what's behind the endpoints, but we are going to go and write a function that gets the actual stock function. We'll just paste it in right here, so that way you guys don't have to go and type it in because it's a lot of information. But it's called, oh yeah, so getting into an API endpoint. That's an excellent question. An API endpoint is essentially a URL that we're hitting on like a server that's just sitting somewhere. And what it does is it returns pieces of information from like a database. What it does is it like bundles it all together, and we kind of create like this bundling process. And then when you make an HTTP request, like essentially, let's go and call this link on the URL, and then actually return the information from the server. And that's kind of how the backend and the front end kind of communicate. We do have some, like in the prerequisite videos, I think we talked about the endpoint stuff as well. So if you need kind of a refresher on that, and then I'm sure, yeah, like the everybody else will help and stuff. And we have some resources to kind of talk about how that information is created. And we'll go into, in the backend workshop, right after this, we'll go into making our own endpoints and the steps it takes to make that. But what's sitting right here? We know that we now have the stock information for the selected stock ID. And now we want to pull information about that stock ID into this component. So remember, like, in the original result, we have like the Apple stock as a certain stock ID. Let's go and try to pull the name of that stock ID. So we're going to find the Apple stock name and then also the symbol, the capital AAPL. That's how we pull the stock information for this piece. So a few things to note about this. It's called an async function. Asynchronous is, we talked about that a little bit in the prerequisite workshop as well, but like kind of giving a brief overview. Asynchronous pretty much means that like, the website constantly needs to run, but when you retrieve information from a server, that takes, a certain amount of time for how it needs to go and ping the server, request information and get that back. Then it needs to, bundle that up, and that whole process takes a while. So we need to essentially like wait for the data to come, and we don't want to like mess anything else up in the application at the same time. So, this kind of gets into this await syntax. If you guys see any errors when you use await as like waiting for this response to get back, you're most likely not wrapping in an async function. So that these things kind of need to be hand in hand, because JavaScript needs to say there's special behavior within this function that allows it to run in this way. So we also have the axios.get. We see that Axios is imported at the top here. It lets us have this nice syntax for getting information. Similarly, if you wanted your application to post information to the server, you could do axios.post and post information in the body, but we're sticking with .get right now. We're appending the stock ID. So, we can render the stock ID right here, but we can also just use it in the other functions. So, we're getting the stock ID and we can just use it in the API endpoint to pull that information. Once we get a response back, we'll see, and I'll go through the console.log for this information. We're going to need to make sure that it's a valid response, because there's a series of HTTP codes. Tristan can also send a link to HTTP codes and what they mean, but 200 essentially means that it's a good code, and we want to render the data that came with that. And then we also have like the console for this information. Like if we have like a negative, like an error pulling the stock. So we have this function, it pulls stock information at a certain stock ID. How do we want to run this function? And this kind of gets into the usefx again. We can go here, copy the get stock syntax or get stock usefx. This has a few pieces in it. First, we have the actual usefx structure. We pass it a function which performs something. And this function is run anytime one of the parameters in this array is changed. So right now we don't need it to change because we just want it to render one time when we initialize the app. So there's no reason to make it be waiting on other information. But just a little bit of logic, simple logic here. If the stock ID is valid, then we're going to get the stock at that stock ID. And you could either just like use it as a variable in the component. I'd even recommend just going and putting it as a stock ID argument into the function. And then also we have a console.log for this information right here. Looks like I broke something, but I'll go through and refresh here. So now, what's this component doing? We're first initializing the component with the stock ID that's coming from the URL. We're now running this function, checking if the stock ID is valid, and then we're pulling the stock information at this. And this is kind of a repeat of the prerequisite workshop, going in a little deeper, but we should see that we start to have, if we went and did console.log stocks, stocks. And I'd recommend every time you write one of these API calls, throw console.log out down so you can see what information is coming here. Right now we're getting no, data with this specific stock ID. I think this is because I, threw in some random numbers. So here we see an array of one item. So, this kind of gets into, now we have our, first component, which has the pieces of information very similarly to how we rendered the user cards. So, now what can we do? Because this like component logic, has a few different elements, we're not only pulling the stock information onto this page and representing it in a card, we're also going and pulling the stock data, and I'd recommend just like getting your component working for having the stock data. There's kind of two ways you can do it. You can either code it data first, where you try to get all of the data flow working and then you build the UI around that. That's what we'll do in this case, or you could build the UI with like no data and then kind of link in all of these different functions to pull in data and show on the component. Either way works, it's kind of personal preference. I think in the context of this, it'll be the easiest if we just show data first. And that kind of follows along on the Notion page. So, what's happening in the stock thing as well is we're setting the stock to be the data that's coming in this console.log. So now, once we pull this data, we'll see that when stock is valid, then we can kind of, maybe after we pull the stock, we're going to go and pull the stock data. Like we don't want to pull the different data points before we actually have the stock information. So we can add another use effect. And this is going to be watching stock rather than just watching nothing. And then it will go and get the stock prices after the stock is valid. That's like a decently simple piece of logic, but it's kind of important to think that when you're building this component that has like complex logic, you don't want to be performing tasks before you have the data that's available or necessary. And then, right here, we also have the get stock prices function. We'll throw it right here. I'd recommend leaving all of your usefx at the top of the page along with the variables. This is the structure we generally follow because then, if you want to see any data that's within the component, you have all the stocks. Then you have all the usefx, with all the mapping, what functions need to run, and then all the functions will just be listed right here. So, hopefully. So there it is, nice and formatted. Here's the get stock prices function. And you'll see that this is actually super, super simple, and super, super similar to the previous one. It almost looks identical, except we're making an API request to a different endpoint. What pieces of information does this API request have? It has the stock symbol, and then it also has the actual token. So this is something I might have forgotten to mention this, but we do have a .env file that we'll need to get you guys for this to work. It's called a .env.sample. It has just like this code right here. I'm going to throw it in the chat right here. So when you go to your .env file, if you don't have one locally, we don't want to push the env files up to GitHub. So if you don't have it, go to your .env file and paste this piece of information in here, and you will have to restart your React server. So you'll have to go and force close the React start or yarn start, and then you'll need to do yarn start again to get this environment variable initialized. So how do we access these .environment variables? React makes it fortunately pretty easy with create React app already having this process information. You will need to prepend it with this React app, syntax right here. So that way, you know that it's a React variable. But this lets us have like our standard API keys and stuff that we wouldn't want to push to GitHub or show anybody else because they could exploit. Of course, we're not doing perfect either because all of you guys are using my secret key, so you could easily get my FinHub account banned, but don't worry too much about that. So similarly, we'll go and set the stock prices and pull this information right here. And we can go and see if you pull up the FinHub. Tristan can throw the link for FinHub documentation as well. They have this whole API that you can go and adjust this and maybe graph some other information, but it'll show you the end format that'll be resulting from this FinHub API status. Specifically, the stock.candle endpoint. I'll throw it in the chat right here. This is the API endpoint on the FinHub URL that we're hitting. So I'm going to take a sip of water. Just, if anybody has any questions, we can kind of use this as a breakpoint, just to take like a little bit of a breather. If anyone has anything else they want to ask. So how are we all doing? All right, it seems like we are doing all right. Hopefully everybody's following along and like the Notion page is helping. Yeah, let's go over the different directories and pages. So what do we have in this application? There's kind of a few different pieces, and in React apps, we generally have, they follow this really hierarchical structure, kind of. You render one component at the top level and it renders everything recursively down. Just think of it as like a series of functions that's returning pieces of visual code that we want to show. Where does that start in this application? Technically, it's the app.index.js, but this is like where the React-y stuff is. Don't worry too much about that. Think about the app.js as like our most top level application for a React project. This is the single function that's called one time, and then everything else is rendered according to that. So this is why, we have some different pieces of information that could be here. Like Tristan and I worked on a project that required authentication across the entire application. So we used the context API, which is a way of passing down the tree. Don't worry too much about that. But we kept the login information, in the top level. So that way any subcomponents could go and reach that information. It's also why we have the routes here. The routes let us go and optionally render different components based on what the URL is saying. So let me read this question a little bit. Exactly, like it kind of does. So the app.js is where you'll keep all of your routes and you'll decide what pages to show based on the URLs. So that lets you navigate from any button to any other page really easily, because all you have to do is link to that URL and then have the URL defined right here. So, by the end of ZotHacks, it's pretty like realistic that you guys will have like, multiple pages with like multiple, stock info, stock pictures or something, just any piece of information. And all of these routes will kind of be available because they're all sitting at the top level of your React project. Again, like I talked about this in the prerequisites, but like really the best way to think about it is just like function, functions that render functions and stuff. So if you have any other follow-up questions, don't be afraid to ask it in the chat again. So let's go and see the user card. I did forget to throw this in the Notion, but one thing that we can do right here is wrap your cards with this link right here. What this does is it attaches an A tag, which is just a link to the entire card. So that way, when you click on it, it will send you to the URL. And you'll see that this like /stock ID matches the URL that you have right here. If we did, stocks right here, what sort of behavior would we expect to see right there? That pretty much means it's going to take us to the stocks, stocks URL instead, but we don't have an app.js, route right here. So it's not going to take us to anything and it'll end up being a blank page. So hopefully that gives a little more context into this. And, again, don't worry too much about this like trend animation stuff that we have added. This is kind of just like, so that way it looks a little nicer when you guys start the project, but you can very easily just remove like the motion and then this animate initial transition piece of information. And if we have extra time with this workshop, we'll get into like how you could write animations with a framer motion library that I have imported into the React project. And just some advice, like when you're doing your demos at hackathons, if you have fancy animations for your UI, like it'll look miles ahead of anything else that's out there. Yeah, the front page. Exactly. So, let's go through like navigating how the page kind of renders as we go through. When we have the initialized application on just an empty URL right here, this will go and render the user list because we're saying at just an empty path renders the user list. The user list goes and renders all of the cards based on the database information that we get from the URL, and each card has its own piece of information. We're passing the user, the index, and then what number of card it is, which is how we show this little number right here. So then we want these cards to route to individual pages per each user. So the behavior that we want for that is we want the card to go and set the URL to the stock URL. It's a little bit back and forth, but once you kind of get like, once it kind of clicks of how you use these links to navigate, we then now have the code right here, which links to it. We click this, and then we need to think, all right, what is this URL rendering? We go to app.js, it renders the user stock directory or the user stock component. And this user stock component has all of this like more complex logic for the specific page. Yeah, so to make sure that we're on time with this piece of information, we're going to just do one thing. Let's go and think about what's happened so far. We have the stock prices. We passed this data, and we'll see that we did the set stock prices. So one thing that you can do is when you're going and debugging in your React component, you're going to really commonly want to see what's in the variables. So you can use usefx as a debugging tool where, let's say that stock prices is checking right here. So this usefx is watching the stock prices variable. Let's just go in console.log stock prices. So this is a super simple, really helpful debugging technique for React. We want to go and log in the console what this variable is anytime that it changes. So going back here, we'll see that first, initially, it loads as null because technically it still changed right here when we initialized it as null. Then what we have is, I'll zoom in a little bit to make it a little easier. So it first initialized as null, and then it changed after we performed our set information. And then we went console.log at the same line. You can look at the lines right here, and they'll correspond. There's all of our stock information, which is essentially just, a list of 77 values. That was like the date range that I pulled. So, there we go. We kind of know that like after this component initializes, it goes and pulls the stock IDs. It goes and first pulls the stock information. Then it uses this other API that's completely different to pull the stock IDs. And this is kind of getting into like how you'll build a more complex application for ZotHacks. So what can we do now? Now we have all of the elements. Like it's really like we completed our logic of clicking on a card, sends us to the stock page, and it pulls the stock information to that. So now, it's actually pretty easy. We just have, a few different pieces. This stuff, I'm just going to kind of do a lot of copying and pasting because it is a lot of like nitty gritty things to get through. And ultimately, like you're going to want to read the documentation, but I'll talk a little bit about the different pieces that make up the page. And, ultimately, it's just kind of like HTML and CSS to get the rest together. One thing that we're going to do is let's go and add this format stock function page. What is this used for? This essentially uses a .map function, and then it maps a list of single numbers because we saw on our inspect element right here, this was just a list of like 77 numbers. The format that we want this graphing library to use, it has just a list of objects that have an X and a Y attribute. So that's why this is useful. We write our formatting functions in the routing component or React component as well. Don't worry too much about that, but these are kind of like things that you can use to filter and refine your data for easier use in the application. I also have some more imports right here for the React Viz components. Again, this is a little more complicated that kind of is a little unnecessary. You guys can steal this graph code, for your own projects or something, or, Tristan can throw in I think also in the Notion, I have the React Viz documentation. You can go and see how to make your own custom chart for this information as well. So let's go and we actually don't even need to copy this because I have another copy block. This is kind of going to be like that meme where it it says start drawing an owl and you draw a circle and then like draw the rest of the owl. But I'll kind of go into the elements that make this up. Maybe we can start from scratch if we have time, but I just kind of want to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end regarding like overall React functionality, because this stuff is a little easier to kind of get on your own. So we're just going to go and draw the remainder of the owl, and we'll fill in the page with the information that we have right here. What is this information? It's first a div, then another div, and then another div and another div. This is kind of how you build up your design of the site. You'll just do a series of divs that you order and organize using Flexbox or CSS Grid, attached in the CSS files that you have right here. I also need to go and add the CSS information for this code as well. Give me 1 second. I'll throw this in the Notion in a moment after I'm done talking about this. Just to kind of fill it in, here's all of the CSS that I wrote for this specific component. Again, it's kind of a lot to explain just in the context of this one workshop, but I'd really recommend going and deleting specific parts. So maybe like, let's get rid of the graph. You can get rid of the graph and comment that out. You can even just completely delete it. let's go and get rid of like these images and things for these pieces of information. Go and try to just like construct the component piece by piece, looking at how the classes interact with the classes that are defined right here. And the reason we can use the CSS file is because we just have our little import statement right here. So any of the classes that we have in our React file right here on our HTML code can be accessed. There's a lot of words, but you'll actually notice that most of it is actually just display flex, like it's different flexbox classes for these pieces of information. And what does that end with? It ends with a pretty component that renders the different pieces. First, it takes a look at what's in the URL, then it pulls the stock information, then it pulls the stock time and stock numbers using a different API. And I'd highly recommend just going and trying these different pieces and building up the self, or even like, we have the graph component. We can just kind of get rid of this and, see what happens when we just type like hello right here. How could we build up a UI? We'll notice that it covers it based on the CSS, but I'd recommend starting from scratch with this piece and trying to build in your own custom card to get that information ready. But again, like one piece to note is React components, they re-render this return statement. It will re-return that statement any time of state variable changes. When does a state variable change? Anytime you use these set functions that you're creating. Set stock prices, set stock. These are all defined in this use state. And this is kind of how you build your React logic. You have a series of behaviors that happen, in a sequential order, or based on when other things happen using the usefx. Then you also have all of your information of the component stored in these use states. And anytime that you update the data, then you just re-render it. And you can have some, null data. Like one thing right here is we have this little like stock or, or object syntax. This is actually to prevent an error, if the stock is undefined when we initially load the page. Because if it tries to render stock.company name before stock is not null, then it'll throw an error because it's trying to find an attribute of company name. And that's just like, you can't find an attribute of a null object. But you can actually find an attribute of a single object that doesn't have that attribute, because then it'll just be undefined and render as null rather than exploding. These are some like little nitty gritty things. You're going to have to do a lot of error checking and making sure that your data is valid and clean. Kind of like how the data going into this line series has its own formatter object or formatter function, which goes and creates this object of X and Y pairs. So I think I'm going to leave it at that in terms of like the code that needs to be done to get this function working. I also have something, in the Notion file that has all of the animations. It seems like we're going to be a little out of time, or I'll wait for questions and then maybe we can squeeze it in the last 5 minutes of a little bit of animations, which are really fun to do and very easy with the frame or motion library. So, this is kind of like how we build our complex logic and navigating around the application. And, all of you guys will have mentors who will help you, get the project done. And then you can also feel free to reach out to Tristan or I on Slack, or just, anyone in the channel about any specific React help. But I highly recommend putting in the time to learn React if you want to learn web development, just because I think a lot of internships are based around that, a lot of industry information. Like, I'm willing to bet that like the 30 to 50% of the graduating class will be interacting with some form of React when they finish. Yeah, and what was the last piece from that I copied and pasted? That piece is right here. It's the return HTML without animations. This goes and returns all of the HTML code, or technically JSX it's technically JSX code, because it's like not really HTML, just because we can put variables like in line with the curly bracket syntax. But this is kind of the object that this user stock library is going. And if we wanted to delete that, or if we wanted to just like not have the graph, let's go and see, hello, this is a line chart. we'll see that it renders, hello, this is a line chart right here, rather than the different graphs. So, you can kind of go and take a look at the information that we have here sitting in the JSX. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions? Kind of wrapping up during the last 5 minutes. We'll try to leave a little bit of time just so you can take a breather. Where do I think the best place to start with the project is? Honestly, like the workshop directory that you have right now is a great place to start. You can just go and rename the files, and that'll give you a really good, you'll really understand how the import statements kind of work through going and renaming the files to whatever project you do. We have like a lot of the imports. Also, one thing is I have these nice little template files available, so that way you can do that. If you're having any issues with only getting like the company logo, you can reach out to the mentors, screenshot like your console.log. But yeah, going back to starting with the project, I think the workshop directory, you can just go and do, just to show you guys, in case you guys haven't used Git, because we have all this code like finished and live, in case you want to compare and see what the final product works, so you can compare to see what you're missing, is you can just go and do git checkout workshop. And the workshop directory, okay, so see, I made a bunch of changes. So git reset -- hard. It looks like I messed up my directory a little bit, but if you go and just do git checkout workshop with a directory that's unchanged from what you initially cloned, you'll get the original place. And I think that that's like a good place to start with the project, and then mentors will kind of help you with the information.
Yeah.
And yeah, regarding the only company logo, we can do a little deeper dive. Just throw into like the tech support channel like a screenshot or something of what you're getting.
Just to add off that, I really recommend that you try to understand the code here as much as possible, because I know right now it's probably very overwhelming. There's probably, most of you probably have never used JavaScript before or seen JavaScript, and we've got a ton of files in here, right? So it's probably all like a lot of new stuff that you've never seen before. So the first place you should start is, like Lasse said, app.js is kind of that first place that everything starts from. Kind of just trace your way through and see, based on the imports, okay, this is what this component does, and then just work your way all the way down and try to really understand what everything does. And if you can't figure something out, we're here to support you in that. So, but really try not to guess too much. I would say really try to understand what's going on so that you can then create with it. Otherwise, yeah, you'll probably just stay lost if you kind of just assume things. So really try to understand it. I think that we've got so many people here that can help you out. Yeah, you'll have to put in a little bit of work, but I'm sure everyone here can do it. So.
Yeah, and ultimately, the start's the hardest. Every half an hour that you put in right now of really just kind of deleting code and seeing what happens, or adding code and seeing what happens, will most likely save you another hour or two come mid-Saturday. Just because if you get a really good base of knowing how this existing application that we've set up for you guys works, then it'll be a really good experience to just kind of build off of that, if you kind of know the elements that make this up. It looks like I got a few more questions on this. I'm going to just throw this in the everyone chat so that way we can see it. So really quick, just before we leave off, I think we've got some questions regarding the class names. So why do we wrap everything in div? So a React component can only return one singular div. It always needs to have a singular parent wrapper. You can't return a div and then a div together, and it'll, VS Code will yell at you if you do that. So every component needs to return one thing, and that's why you have a wrapper. And if you ever need to return multiple things, then you can also just wrap it in an empty wrapper. That's one piece of React trickiness that not too many people utilize, but it's actually super helpful. And why did we include the class name attributes? The class name attributes tell what classes style based on the classes that we have right here. So we have the selected stock and stock info. This piece of information we have right here. So just to kind of show how this behavior is working. It looks like I broke my code because I like reset master or something. So I'm sorry, I can't live demo that right now, but you'll go and see that this is a one-to-one correspondence of right here. And this CSS SAS file actually follows the same hierarchical structure. So you'll see that selected stock is a child component or child div of user stock. Very similar right here, user stock and then selected stock. And then I also have some helper CSS files. You'll notice in globals, we can do after the backend workshop, just maybe like a directory overview, kind of going over big picture stuff, looking at a deeper dive in all of the files for that. So, but we can go over that. But there's kind of some CSS classes scattered throughout the application, but you'll mostly keep it the same structure in your SAS file. Hopefully that answers your question. And then if anyone else has any other questions, you can throw it in the chat, or we can start to transition into the backend workshop, which is, hopefully it'll be a little more familiar. I think it'll be a little less overwhelming. And again, if you feel overwhelmed, do not worry. You're in the first hour of the hackathon. And I can't anticipate it'll take more than just like, few hours to really figure out how all this stuff works. Oh yeah, the background gradient for this application. Remember what I talked about with like the app.js as a parent component for all the information here. So I believe right here we have our background image linear gradient. You can take a look at this CSS class. So this is like our entire thing. So similarly, if we wanted to replace and swap the direction of the gradient, we could just do this, and then we'll see that it kind of flip-flops to the side. And then these variables, another good thing about SAS is we have the variables stored right here. So you can put all of your like shadow variables, your spacing variables, and then like the different colors. I have like the background gradient for this application defined right here. So you can go and change that as well. Just go and change the color and you'll see it update like that. Yeah, so I do want to give enough time for the backend workshop. It looks like we're bleeding into it a little bit, and then we can also give you guys like a 5-minute break like we intended. And then we'll also be super available throughout tonight to get you guys started. So do not worry, don't feel stressed. It's a lot of information to take in, and frankly, it took me a few hackathons before I like really understood React. But we're hoping to get you guys off to a good start with all of this stuff. And don't be afraid to ask questions. We have tons of mentors for that very specific reason.
All right, thank you so much, Lasse. So yeah, we'll be transitioning to the Hopin page for now, and we're going to give Hopin a shot again. And if that doesn't work, we'll switch over to Zoom again. So thank you so much, guys, for coming. And hopefully we'll see you in the backend session. So
yeah, thanks, guys.
See you guys later.